Hello, this is the Fiction Nonfiction Podcast from Literary Hub, where we believe that every issue in your social media feed or on the evening news has already been tackled somewhere in literature. I'm V.V. Ganeshananthan, also known as Sugi, author of the novel Brotherless Night.
And I'm Whitney Terrell, author of the novel The Good Lieutenant.
So, Whit, if I gave you, like, say, 200 or 300 cells, do you think you could take them for a walk or like toss the football around?
Okay. That ranks a high on lists of weird opening questions that we've had at the beginning of the podcast. That's like,
I
I
did
don't
not
understand.
I did not install this fuckery into the conversation. You've raised two
Okay.
sons, so you have a lot of experience with children. And just recently, the Alabama Supreme Court has declared that all embryos are children, whatever their location. So I'm wondering if maybe you could give some babysitting tips to this judge who's just created by legal fiat. I don't even know how many new unsupervised children in Alabama, if not the country at large.
Well, I mean, first of all, they're very cold. I would warm them up. I don't know. I guess that's the wrong thing to do. Then I would be in big trouble. Maybe what we need is somebody to babysit the judge. I would be volunteering for that. I could throw footballs at him. I mean, under what rationale could a person decide that a microscopic collection of cells is a child?
Well, that's one of the questions we're going to address today. And to help us puzzle through that Alabama ruling and its legal and political implications, as well as the science behind in vitro fertilization, we're joined today by my friend Briallen Hopper. Briallen is the author of Hard to Love Essays and Confessions, a collection of essays on love and friendship. It was a Kirkus Best Memoir of the Year and a CBC Best International Nonfiction Book of the Year, as well as a finalist for a Washington State Book Award. Her second book, Gilead Reread, is forthcoming from Columbia University Press. Her work has appeared in the New Republic, the Paris Review, New York Magazine's The Cut, and the Washington Post, among many others. She grew up in Tacoma, Washington, lives in Elmhurst, Queens, and teaches creative nonfiction in the MFA program at Queens College, CUNY. Briallen, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
So just starting off, I think it's important for our listeners and maybe ourselves to understand the science behind in vitro fertilization and embryo preservation. What happens during in vitro fertilization? What is an embryo? How big is it? Why does it need to be
Yeah,
frozen?
lots of questions. So in terms of what happens, it's the IVF process is a process where egg production is stimulated through hormonal injection shots that take place over a period of up to 2 weeks. So there's a period where women or people with ovaries are like injecting themselves every day, going in for daily blood work, ultrasounds like every day, every other day to kind of like monitor egg production. So it's like a pretty time consuming process. And then when the eggs are deemed to be ready, there's actually a surgery called an egg retrieval. Typically, you actually like go under full anesthesia. You're kind of like unconscious during that period of time. They go in and retrieve eggs. And then once they've retrieved them, that's the in vitro part. Then they put them in glass. There are a couple of ways that eggs can get fertilized. So one is they just kind of like put in some sperm with some eggs in a dish and hope for the best and see what happens. The more kind of like complicated, tricky way to do it when they feel like there's a chance that the sperm might need a little help is they actually inject one individual sperm into like each individual egg to try to create fertilized eggs, which is obviously like very tricky. This is all microscopic. it's all invisible to the naked eye.
Can't see any of this without heavy
No,
magnification.
we're talking about like individual cells. So that's basically the process through which IVF happens. In terms of what is an embryo, so there's like different names for embryos at different stages of the process. There's like a zygote, and then all the way up to like a blastocyst, and like different at different
Oh, I
stages there are
remember
different
learning
names.
this in
Yeah,
science class. Yeah.
exactly. So over the course of few days, typically, depending on whether you're doing there are different kinds of IVF cycles. There's fresh cycles where they try to like create an embryo and then kind of like immediately put it, once it's made, put it back in so it can then just continue to grow. So with those embryos, they usually kind of like watch them grow just for like a few days to see if they're growing, if they're growing like well and quickly, then they can kind of look and see which ones seem to be like doing the best, which have the best likelihood to make it. Um, but what the Alabama ruling was about, and what's a very common thing to happen with IVF, is freezing embryos. And there are different reasons why you would do this. Um, a big one is if you want to test embryos to see if there are like any kind of like genetic issues, to find out like which ones might have problems that might mean that they would likely result in a miscarriage. But they're not able to really do that till the embryos reach the blastocyst stage, which typically happens around at 5 or 6 days after the eggs are fertilized. And at that point, they're a clump of like maybe 200 to 300 cells. They just take a few, if they're testing, they take a few cells out, send them off, see if there are any issues that are important to know about before putting the embryo in. And at each stage of this process, there's just like a ton of attrition. So like you might get a certain number of eggs, only some of them will actually fertilize, only some of those fertilized eggs will make it to like a few days, only some of those will make it to blastocyst. So there's like, it really is not practical to do IVF just sort of like one egg at a time. You really need you know that like a lot of the eggs are not going to make it, a lot of the fertilized eggs are not going to make it. So you have to kind of really build in enough numbers so there's a chance that some of the embryos will actually be viable.
I mean, as happens when people are trying to get pregnant naturally, I mean, very often a fertilized embryo will not attach to the uterine wall, or any number of things
Right.
can happen, right? And I just want to point out, and Sugi is going to ask a question about, your own personal experience, but, and we're going to get to this legal part, but the Alabama Supreme Court has said that these embryos, these 200 to 300 cell collections, are people. They are very small people,
Yeah.
right? That's what we're talking about here.
Yeah. I mean, in reality, like all that I've been describing in terms of the attrition, like all of that is happening like just inside people. We just don't know about it or can't see it. But a huge number of fertilized eggs like never turn into like full-term pregnancies. Like there's very, very high rates of pregnancy loss and miscarriage. Like often people aren't even aware of it because it happens like so early. So yeah, just like there's a way that like bodies are doing a lot of kind of essentially determining like which eggs have like a good shot, and then sort of like investing in, your body decides like, okay, this fertilized egg has a good chance of making it. I'm going to go ahead and go through with the pregnancy. So yeah, there's just like a lot of pregnancy loss in like the normal course of things.
So just one, when you were talking about retrieval before, I was curious, like, I mean, all of that sounds, as you said, very time intensive and probably very uncomfortable. Is egg retrieval, is that endoscopic? Are you getting cut open?
Um, so they go in through your vagina. So it's not actually an incision. But it can be extremely painful, and actually it shouldn't be, but I wrote an essay recently for the Los Angeles Review of Books Quarterly, where I'm one of the people who had an egg retrieval done at the Yale Fertility Center, where they were not properly managing pain as a result of a nurse stealing some fentanyl. So there are cases where it can be a tremendously painful process with like a really intense recovery time. Most of the time, it shouldn't be that bad, but it is like the whole experience of going through the process It's like an overwhelming hormonal experience. When I've been through it 3 times, like you kind of like swell up because you typically in any given cycle you're just dealing with 1 or 2 egg follicles, but because you are dealing with maybe like you suddenly have like 20 or 30 that are also the follicles that are swelling inside of you, like little balls of fluid to protect the microscopic eggs inside. Like I actually looked like I was maybe like, 4 months into a pregnancy. My abdomen was so swollen. It's like the whole process is pretty physically taxing, and there's often kind of like cramping and a difficult recovery period after the retrieval.
So, along with the science that you've so helpfully outlined for us, every person seeking to freeze embryos or to use IVF um, has, of course, incredibly personal reasons for doing that. And you chose to freeze embryos as opposed to freezing your eggs. If you could talk a little bit about that choice and also read from your 2019 Washington Post article on that subject. And for our listeners, we'll put a link to that piece in our show notes.
Sure. So this article is a bit of a time capsule. It's from 4 years ago. And it's about my initial decision to go through with IVF treatment. And at that point, I was in my late 30s. I was single, and I was fortunate enough to live in a state where IVF treatment was covered by my insurance. And IVF just seemed like my best chance of becoming a parent. I'll read a little bit from the article that I wrote. So this is the piece I wrote for the Washington Post about the kind of the difference between freezing eggs and freezing embryos and why I chose to freeze embryos. It's impossible to know the future, but sometimes you can make an educated guess. I'm a single, straight, cisgender 41-year-old woman, and I'm on the part of the chart where the gradual drop off in fertility that happens in the late 30s turns into a steep precipice. Each month, it becomes increasingly unlikely that I'll meet someone and conceive a child with him in the conventional way. If I do end up having a biological child, odds are that child already exists in an early form in the freezer. When I decided to freeze my genetic material, I hoped it would reduce my anxiety about aging and fertility, and thankfully it has. What I didn't anticipate was how it would affect my attitude about romantic love. For most people, pairing off and having kids are linked. First comes love and our marriage, then comes the baby and the baby carriage. For a long time, this is how I thought about love as well. In my 20s and early 30s, the desire to have children with someone was a big part of what prompted me to fall in love and into relationships, as well as a big part of what made me feel stressed during my long stretches of singleness. My 2 long-term boyfriends were both men I thought of as potential parents, but they weren't ready yet. After spending several agonizing years with men who, quote, wanted different things, I started ruling out OkCupid possibilities who said they didn't want kids. Then, at some point, the men who wanted kids started ruling me out. I was getting to be too old. Frozen embryos weren't my initial plan B. First, I looked into adoption and egg freezing, but both options were financially out of reach. Later, I tried artificial insemination with donor sperm, but after a tough pregnancy loss, I was told I would need to have surgery to hold on to a pregnancy, which would delay the process for many months. Ultimately, my doctor and I agreed that it made sense for me to freeze embryos to buy myself some time for surgery and recovery, and to reduce the risk of future pregnancy loss through a genetic screening. Since in vitro fertilization was completely covered by my insurance, this decision made sense financially as well as medically. Between then and now, a lot of things have delayed my path to parenthood. I had a cancer scare, followed by a second major surgery. I got a new job and moved to a new city. I went on book tour. There's been a lot to stress about, but one thing I haven't worried over is finding a man. Now that I have embryos in the bank, a romantic relationship seems less like a prerequisite for parenthood and more like an obstacle to it. I'm sure that somewhere in my city of 8.6 million people, there are a few men interested in dating a woman in my reproductive situation. But outside of an especially far-fetched telenovela, the process of attempting to get pregnant with a donor-conceived embryo seems like too much hassle to try to combine with Tinder. So that was me writing about it 4 years ago. And ironically, less than a year later, I ended up meeting the person I've been living with for 4 years. So my relationship status has changed, and I ended up going through IVF with my current partner. Um, but initially, that was sort of like as a single person when I first decided to freeze embryos, it was as simple as just like what I could afford, what was covered by insurance, and what wasn't, um, and what just sort of seemed most likely to work.
Yeah, I mean, the financial aspect of this, I think, is very important. And that really stood out to Sugi and I when we were reading your article. I did not know that freezing embryos is less costly than adoption or freezing eggs. Why is that?
Well, the answer is that it really depends. So as we know from just sort of seeing the Alabama law, like laws vary widely from state to state, and insurance laws affecting insurance cover vary really widely from state to state. So there are, I believe, 15 states that mandate that insurance needs to cover IVF. 15 out of 50, so not a very high number. And I just
Mm.
was fortunate enough to happen to live in one. But if I lived in most of the country, IVF would not have been covered, and embryos would not have been cheaper. So really, egg freezing is almost never covered by insurance. Occasionally, like if you're going through cancer treatment and it's about fertility preservation as a part of cancer treatment, occasionally egg freezing will be covered by insurance. But usually it's sort of seen as just a kind of like luxury procedure, whereas IVF is seen as, in some cases at least, in some states, it's seen as like a core medical treatment that insurance needs to cover. So the answer is that the costs really vary from state to state. What insurance covers varies really widely from state to state, and also the laws about how this affects queer people, single people, also vary from state to state. So, for example, in Connecticut, as a single person, I was able to access fertility treatment on my own and have it be covered by insurance. That also is something that varies a lot. On the free market, egg freezing is maybe between ten and $20,000 roughly.
Oh my
Um,
God.
a a cycle of IVF costs between maybe $15,000 and $30,000, depending on where you're getting it
Hmm.
done. Many people need multiple cycles, so you could be looking at between like 15,000 and like 120,000, just depending on how many cycles you go through. One person that I was chatting with about this on Twitter recently said that she took out a personal loan of $40,000 to cover
Oh.
IVF treatment to conceive her daughter, and that's like why her daughter has no college fund. So it's very expensive.
So, as you pointed out, these embryos have been biopsied and tested for chromosomal abnormalities. You kind of laid that timeline out for us a little bit. So they are in some ways less risky than a regular pregnancy, in which the embryo can't be tested at that early stage for abnormalities or variants until it's already formed in the uterus. So it would be safer. It would give women a better chance to have successful pregnancies. Am I understanding this correctly?
That's absolutely true. So if you're having a pre-screened embryo inserted, it's much more likely that you'll be able to carry that pregnancy to term. And this being able to test becomes it's sorry, I'm not explaining this very well. um, the main thing that I wanted to say was that for people who go into a situation knowing that there's a much higher likelihood that they could have trouble, either because they have genetic issues coming into it or they're older, it can be a huge reassurance to kind of like know that they're not facing a pregnancy with a child that has a particular genetic condition they know that they're at risk for.
I mean, I just want to point out and underline. I mean, we asked this question because as we'll discuss now, the ideology behind the Alabama State Supreme Court, the Supreme Court ruling is soaked in anti-abortion language and thought, but actually, in practical terms, it's making it harder for people to have babies. And also, when people have a baby with a genetic abnormality, they tend to want to have an abortion, or at least that's one of the options, right? So it actually increases that risk. It just makes no sense at all in that way. I'm not going to ask you to respond to that because you're nodding and I see that you would agree.
Yes.
But I do think that this is where we want to go to the ruling itself and start talking about what it actually says. And so I'm going to read the first paragraph because this is a thing, this is about language, right? It's not
Hmm.
about science. It's about
Right.
naming things and declaring that
Yes.
things are so because
Yes.
of language, not because they've been proven in any way scientifically.
Right.
And here's the first paragraph. The court has long held that unborn children are, quote, children, unquote, for the purposes of Alabama's Wrongful Death of a Minor Act, a statute that allows parents of a deceased child to recover punitive damages for their child's death. The central question presented in these consolidated appeals, which involve the death of embryos kept in a cryogenic nursery, is whether the act contains an unwritten exception to that rule for extrauterine children, that is, unborn children who are located outside of a biological uterus at the time they are killed. Under existing black letter law, the answer to that question is no. The Wrongful Death of a Minor Act applies to all unborn children, regardless of their location. So, can you help us unpack the language here, which I think is really important?
This is really religious language. This is an expression of a religious belief about life and when it begins. That's a very, it's a minority belief. It's most people throughout history, most religious people throughout history, and most people in the U.S. don't subscribe to this idea that uh, like a couple of cells are a child. But this is kind of enshrining that into law. And there are already, just like with the criminalization of pregnancy in various ways, like holding it, like for example, if a woman takes a prescription medication that like might have bad effects during pregnancy, or gets into an argument and that results in a fight that results in a miscarriage, like there are already cases where women have been held responsible for manslaughter for choices that they make when they're pregnant. And this is just sort of taking that already deeply, deeply troubling legal precedent to just a kind of ludicrous extreme, where it's essentially just like microscopic cells in the freezer become children.
So I also want to point out, because I feel like I was doing my homework for this episode and learned this and was sort of like, what? But the reason that this case went to the Alabama Supreme Court for this ruling is because there were parents who had gone through cycles of IVF, and they had multiple embryos at this cryogenic nursery, and they had actually successfully gone through IVF and had children. And their remaining embryos were in this cryogenic nursery, and a patient in the hospital went into the cryogenic nursery and like put his hands in the tank and took, like, reached in and got embryos, and then got burned because they were cryogenically frozen, and then dropped the embryos, which was how they died. And so how the embryos were destroyed. So these parents were suing the cryogenic nursery and wanted to sue under the Wrongful Death of a Minor Act that Whitney mentioned before in the ruling. And the initial ruling was that they were not deceased children, and so this wouldn't stand, and then they appealed it. So now they can proceed with their lawsuit. But like, that is why we are having this conversation. We're having this conversation because a person a patient in that hospital wandered into the cryogenic nursery and reached into the tank. This is wild to me. Um, just like, what even? I mean, what kinds of security are there? I mean, there should be so much security around these things, right? It's like biological material. It's personal
Right.
material.
And this is actually, a topic, well, that deserves its whole conversation, but this is part of something really troubling, which is that fertility treatment and fertility centers are, and that whole process is like pretty unregulated, And like just whether you're talking about sperm donation, whether you're talking about like embryo preservation, it's just kind of the more that you look into it, the more disturbed you get. Like it's essentially law is like clearly not keeping up with technology, and there's like very little protection or regulation around how embryos are made.
I mean,
Um,
the other thing is that, okay, there was this crazy dude who tried to steal the embryos, who obviously the court wanted to rule on this. And like, I
right,
think like they wanted to change this law, and that this was an opportunity, but you can see how this law would be used. Let's say
right,
that a couple create embryos together and then separate. And then one of them is with another partner and says, well, I don't want those embryos to be used anymore. Let's get rid of them. And the other partner can say, well, if you do, I'm going to sue you for
right.
murder. Right. And then there's these terrible possibilities there. Is that not true?
Yeah. I mean, there are already really complicated embryo custody battles playing out in court. But the threat of throwing like murder in there definitely takes it to a new level.
So the main focus of this story has been that by declaring embryos to be children, the Alabama Supreme Court has in essence made IVF illegal. And then as of just earlier, I guess, is it today? Um, the state legislature passed a bill that would protect IVF, but like this is going to be an ongoing conversation. I should say we're taping this on Friday, March 1st, and as you all know, everything changes every hour, every minute. So you need more than one embryo to make IVF possible, but this means that not every embryo will become an actual living child. So what is it that you are supposed to do exactly with your embryos that are remaining? Are you just supposed to leave them in the cryogenic nursery where they are like not under any kind of regulated security? They're just
Can they
unattended.
inherit? Can they inherit things when you die? Do you have to like
Yeah.
divide your estate up amongst the 17 embryos that you have frozen and then also your two living kids or your dog?
I mean, so already part of the paperwork that you have to sign when you sign up for IVF will ask you what you want done with any excess embryos. The current options are you can have them destroyed. Obviously, under law like Alabama's, that's not going to be okay anymore. The another option is that you can store them indefinitely. This is already very expensive. It costs about $1,000 a year to store embryos. So if that's something that like you yourself are bearing, that like adds enormously to the cost of doing IVF, just $1,000 a year for the rest of your life and maybe like beyond, because frozen embryos last forever. But also that's likely to get even more expensive because the risk of storing them would be so much higher if you know that if something bad happens to them, that counts as murder. The other options I think are hugely troubling, because one option has been to donate embryos to science for fertility research, et cetera. That will no longer be possible if they're considered to be human children. But even worse, there's a movement among evangelical Christians largely to try to adopt embryos that are kind of like excess embryos. They're called snowflake babies, and they see them as kind of trapped souls, like children trapped in ice. And a lot of evangelical Christians see this as a way of like building a family, and they sort of see like kind of adopting these excess embryos as a way of kind of liberating them from being trapped in
Can they
this
pay
terrible
the
limbo.
fees for keeping them frozen instead of the people? Could they
No, no,
could they
they
foot
they
the bill,
actually
please?
they no, they actually give birth to them. Like it's a spiritual
Oh,
calling.
okay.
It's a
Oh my
spiritual
God.
calling to like adopt these snowflake babies and give birth to them. So if you
Wait,
if
so
you Google snowflake babies, you'll see.
Holy cow.
Um,
and if I'm afraid to do that and just want to ask you a follow-up question, Bree, I'm just gonna
yeah.
shudder in horror. So just like how would that work? Like say I went through IVF, I successfully have a child, I have 5 remaining embryos at the cryogenic nursery, and I
Mhm.
receive like what, a call from evangelical Christian family that's like, we are interested in acquiring 3 of your embryos. Like, how does this transaction even work?
I mean, that's a great question, and I don't know specifically the answer, and that would vary from probably would vary from state to state, from clinic to clinic. I do know, I mean, there are some like good cases of, embryos, excess embryos being released for adoption. It doesn't always have to be terrible. And I know someone I know decided to donate an excess embryo to like a couple who's like trying to conceive and wasn't able to. That can actually be a good story. What I'm concerned about is people who choose that, just sort of like releasing the embryos. If you don't choose the like, I want them to store option, you don't store them forever, but you donate them like to science. Do some of them end up becoming snowflake babies, or do some of them kind of like end up being released into this kind of like dubious market of like buying genetic material for religious reasons?
When in that opening paragraph that I read, when it says the court has long held that unborn children are children, I don't know how long, but it's at least it's been since 2019 when Alabama passed this incredibly restrictive abortion law called the Human Life Protection Act that it bans abortions at almost any stage of pregnancy with no exceptions for rape or incest, only allowing abortions if there are serious health risks to the mother, which went into effect after Dobbs, right? And so
Right.
that's what they're talking about, right? I mean, that's the justification behind that law. And that is connected to fundamentalist Christianity, as you're saying,
Right.
it's the language of the anti-abortion movement. Also, the judge later in the decision extensively quotes scripture and Christian theologians to justify his position on the quote unquote sanctity of human life. It feels like this is another ruling in which the church here in America, typified by
Right.
this judge, keeps trying with increasing success to erase the line between church and state.
Absolutely. So, yeah, under official Catholic teaching, life begins at conception, and any kind of like artificial kind of intervention, or most artificial intervention into that process, is considered morally problematic. So, like the Catholic Church has affirmed that IVF is wrong, is morally reprehensible. And also, a lot of evangelical Christians have similar beliefs. But there's a huge gap between this kind of official religious teaching, which is being cited here, and what most Americans actually believe. And this is like where you see these fractures opening up in the Republican Party and in the US generally, where this kind of like the theological idea that a lot of people in the religious right have subscribed to and been fighting for during the last decades of the anti-abortion movement, the life begins at conception, is kind of really clashing with most people's intuitions about when life begins, and also their desire to have fertility treatments available to them. So I feel like this is becoming more and more of a problem, for all of us, clearly for the Republican Party, for anyone who wants fertility treatment, and also just kind of legally. It creates this kind of like chaos where yeah, like people are citing these kind of like pretty niche and extreme theological reasons for intervening in medical care.
So there's been a lot of backlash to this decision in Alabama. And as I mentioned earlier, we're recording on Friday, March 1st. ABC is reporting that roughly half of Alabama's IVF clinics, including the University of Alabama, have paused IVF treatments because of this ruling. I was reading about other IVF patients trying to move their embryos out of Alabama. The Alabama legislature
Would that be
passed a,
kidnapping? Could that be?
I mean, such a galaxy of
Transporting a
possibilities here.
minor over state
Straight
Yeah.
lines. Yeah.
lines. The Alabama legislature passed legislation to restore access to IVF. Basically, they're looking to uh, set up immunity for IVF providers. And then Tammy Duckworth, a Democratic senator, proposed a bill that would federally protect IVF and other fertility treatments. But then she set it up under this system that allows one. It's a consensus thing where one senator opposing it can derail it, and Republican Senator Cindy Hyde-Smith did do that. So that was
I mean, she
sunk.
did that to make someone do it, right? She knows, I think she feels like she's on the winning side of that issue, right?
I mean, I think so. Dems are certainly, it's sort of like there is now this sort of interesting thing going on where Republicans are like, oh, wait, this is actually sort of bad for us. And where Democrats are maybe like successfully painting Republicans as opposed to reproductive rights healthcare. So there's also a measure going forward that I just saw where Cindy Mace in Congress has put forward a resolution sort of being like, we support IVF, but like the measure doesn't contain anything that would actually support IVF. And like all these vulnerable Congress people signed onto it and are like, we support IVF, but like it doesn't, there's no
Right.
there. So yeah, so as Whitney pointed out, Duckworth's bill was essentially designed to dare Republicans to oppose it. Um, how much evidence do you feel like is this going to be a problem for Republicans and as much of a problem as the Dobbs decision on abortion?
I mean, I think it's going to be a huge problem for Republicans, but I also don't have any faith in the Democrats' ability to appropriately capitalize on it. I feel like there's I also feel like the Republican Party has this kind of like alliance between people who have these like very extreme religious beliefs and are kind of like fighting this holy war battle where they really want a national abortion ban. Some of them want a national contraception ban. Some of them want a ban on fertility treatment, and they're kind of in the same party with people who are just trying have been using abortion as kind of like a way to kind of like galvanize people, but not really like thinking through the implications. So yeah, I mean, I think basically the Republicans are saddled with if to the extent that they subscribe to this belief that life begins at conception, they're buying into a lot of tremendously unpopular potential policies and rulings that are going to kind of like come back to bite them. But yeah, I grew up in the anti-abortion movement, and people really believe that this is like, this is the equivalent of genocide, that there are, so many children dying that, they have to intervene in any way they can. And I feel like I think that like over the course of the next years and decades, we're going to be seeing things like reproductive care in the form of fertility treatment, in the form of contraception, obviously abortion, more and more under threat.
Well, that seems like a good place to end. Bree, thanks for joining us. And please check out her essay collection, Hard to Love, at a local bookstore near you, and keep an eye out for Gilead Reread.